Oftentimes I'm interacting with church leadership, and one of the questions that they'll ask in considering whether or not they should move their church towards a church full of missional communities is, should we just go forward and try to transition our church, or should we instead try to start planting new churches with this emphasis? And it's a good question to consider, because the energy and the work it takes to transition a church is pretty intense. And it can take 3 to 5 years, sometimes I think even 7 years, to transition a church towards this approach. And so I want to put in front of them the strengths of planting versus transitioning. And yet I don't want to discourage them from transitioning, but I want to encourage them to think through maybe a dual approach. Like, why not start thinking about planting churches and learning in some ways as an R&D through the planting of new churches that are going to say missional community is the primary organizing structure for making disciples. Those are the kinds of churches we want to start from this point forward. Not only does that give them the opportunity to start from zero and really build a strong foundation on gospel centrality, disciple making as the core mission of the church, equipping with a small group of people that get to multiply out many times over with that DNA built right into it. But it also is a much more affordable model, because they can start with a group of people that doesn't take a lot of money. They don't have to get big buildings. They don't have to put on big programs. They don't have to have lots of teams. They can start with a very small group of people and develop them in the basics of disciple making, which is very cost effective. And in fact, it costs almost nothing to just take a few people and begin to train them on how to do that. So often I'll say, start with planting. In fact, right now, there's a few churches that we're working with that said, from this point on, instead of trying to change our entire church all at once, why don't we just make it a goal that every time we plant a church now, they're going to start with missional communities as the primary organizing structure, which is allowing them to not only see new works get started that in some ways are much more on the ground, much more effective in disciple making, but all of the learning and all of the development that they're getting out there in the field gets to start coming back to the mother church. So therefore it serves the mother church's ongoing learning. And if they decide they're going to transition, they've got all of this R&D that they get to apply to their own church as they look and see what's happening in the field from the people that they've sent out there. The other thing that's great about planting is that there's a lot of freedom for failure. There's a lot of opportunity for learning. There's not nearly as many cost when someone fails, when you're talking about the beginning of a new church plant. It could be 20 or 40 people, and when they make a mistake, they can quickly adjust, they can quickly reorient the way they're going, and it's not nearly as painful or as cost prohibitive in the learning process. So it allows for a lot of learning, it allows for a lot of experimentation. And the other thing is when you get to start a new church, everybody's in the game when you start. They're all on the front end, very seriously considering their role in the making of disciples. When you try to transition a church, what you end up doing is you've got to try and find a few that might take seriously this mission while you're trying to continue to administer to all the others who aren't yet ready to go in this direction. And so you have a really difficult time figuring out how are we going to budget our resources and our staffing and our direction of training and coaching and development, because we really want this group to be able to get started well, but we still have hundreds or even thousands in some cases of people that we still need to care for, we still need to train and develop and serve and lead. And so transitioning can be very difficult. In fact, what often happens is the new pioneering efforts suffer because they don't get the kind of development, they don't get the kind of leadership, they don't get the kind of coaching and consulting that you would give them if they were all on their own, and that was the core of what they were trying to accomplish. When a church gets planted with missional communities as the core organizing principle or structure, oftentimes people think, well, that's a lot easier, of course, because you get to start from square one. It's a fresh start. Everybody's coming in. Everyone's on the same page. And first of all, I want to just clarify that's a fallacy. Even if you start with a core group, they're all not on the same page. We live in a culture and a context in which there's a lot of thoughts about what church is. And so you're not going to avoid that. You're not going to get people that have a zero slate starting point. They're coming in with a preconception of what it means to be a Christian, what it means to be a part of a church, what a church actually is and how it's defined in this culture and day. And so even if you're starting with 20 to 40 or so, a core group, to get a missional community started, you still have to do the same work that you'd have to do it in a transitioning approach. But the good news is it's a lot smaller group, and you actually can find out what every one of them believes about what it means to be a Christian, what it means to follow Jesus, what the gospel is, what a church is, how you actually be the church in the everyday life. And so it is a fallacy to think that you're starting from zero and that you get to build from nothing, but it's also, because it's smaller, you actually have a much more likely opportunity and chance to actually lead them towards what a Christian is, what the gospel is, what a church is, how are we going to do this in the everyday life. Now, even with that said, I regularly am consulting church planners who started with a group of people and they got them all on the same page and they all got excited about it, and that lasts for like about a month, it seems. I mean, people are like, they have this very utopian kind of hopeful optimism about what it's going to be like to be a part of a new church plant. And in many cases, I've found that some people are attracted to a church plant because in their larger church experience, they really didn't get the attention they had hoped. They didn't get the personal development they had hoped. So they're really attracted to this new core because now they get to have someone really pay attention to them and really pour into them. And it doesn't take very long for them to realize this isn't all about you. We're going to actually equip you and train you and send you out to go and reach other people. And so there's a quick disillusionment stage that most people go through in the forming of a new church core, because quickly they realize this is still going to call me to die. I'm still going to have to go through a killing of my flesh. I'm still going to have to grow up in all the basics of what it means to be a follower of Jesus in the everyday stuff of life. No one's going to give me a silver bullet and make this all happen. Now, with that said, at least it's only a few people that you got to do that with, whereas in a transition, you got to do that with everybody. Now, what I also encourage people to do when they plant a church is to keep in mind that they're probably going to have to replant their church, likely on a yearly basis. I remember when we first started Soma, we said, we're going to have to replant it every single year. And the reason why I say that is not because we failed so badly the year before and now we got to start all over again, but rather you're working with a group of people that you lead forward, and all of a sudden new people come, new people are added, both those who are brand new Christians as well as those who've been steeped in Christianity for many years. And so you have to retransition them on a yearly basis. And your church changes and the culture changes. So you got a whole bunch of people, they all came to faith. Hopefully by God's grace, they're being sanctified, which means they're different after a year. But you're also dealing with a culture that's all around you that's constantly changing. Worldviews are constantly changing. World issues are constantly changing. And so you have to regularly teach your people to expect that the only thing that's not going to change around here is the gospel of Jesus Christ. That God is the same yesterday, today, and forever, but we won't be. We will change. We'll hopefully be sanctified. We'll be going through an ongoing transformation. And so there almost needs to be a starting and stopping point. Not a literal starting, but a pausing, a looking at what you are and saying, okay, who have we become? Where are we going? What are we trying to accomplish? Is this the best way to accomplish making disciples who make disciples in this context, in this day, in this age, with these people? And then refocusing all of your energies to say, if we were to start all over again, how would we do it? And in financial circles, they call that zero-based budgeting, where you basically say, with what we have and where we're at, how would we spend all of this money in light of where we're going as a company? Churches need to do the same thing. In light of who we are and where we're at, where are we going to put our energies and our resources? Where do we need to train? Where do we need to develop? Let's re-budget all of that every year. And in a sense, let's refocus our energies every year so we don't lose sight of the primary mission, which is to glorify God through the making of disciples who make disciples. In that sense, if the church gets used to a regular cycle of replanting, of refocusing, of rebudgeting, of restewarding, of re-energizing the church toward mission, then it'll get normative for the people of God to expect that they're going to have to continually engage in the process of change throughout their whole life. I was reflecting on this recently because I was telling someone about marriage and saying that I didn't marry, the wife that I'm now married to is not the wife I married when we first got married. She is a different woman. And it seems like just when I figure out how to love my wife and lead her really well, she changes on me. And that's because she's growing and she's becoming more Christ-like and she's becoming stronger in being the woman God meant her to be. And so I have to keep learning how to grow and change as I'm learning how to lead her and love her and serve her. And so I don't have the same wife every day. You won't have the same church every day. You won't have the same core that you started with. Some of your core are going to change. Some of your core are going to leave. So there's going to be a lot of transition. And so in a sense, you're always saying, God, who's the core now? Who's the leadership now? Who's the church now? How are we going to reach the people you sent us to reach now? So you're always rethinking, how do we plant and replant and replant and replant the church? The beauty of missional communities is that you actually create a mechanism within your church that operates like a core group within the church. And so it's a lot easier to have a missional community rethink that over and over again every year, because it's maybe 12 to 25 people that are saying, okay, in light of who we're called to reach, in light of who God's given us, in light of who we've become, how are we going to reach that group of people this year in a unique way as the people of God in this place? That's a whole lot easier to refocus and replant than to replant an entire church of several hundred people. And if we can get a church made up of missional communities that are replanting every year, then it's more likely they're going to be effective in that replanting process on a yearly basis. So in light of that idea of rebudgeting or zero-based budgeting, when you consider the cost of what it takes to help a people regularly replant, rethink, refocus, reallocate all their energies, and now you take a large church that existed for a long time, or even a small church that's existed for a long time, there is a huge cost in considering transitioning your church. There are programs that have been in place for a long time that people love, and they would say that to them is church. Those literal programs are for them what it means to be a part of this church. The staff that support those programs, that when you start thinking about transitioning, you actually have to reconsider, do we need any of these people, or do we need to reconsider who we need to hire? How do we reorganize staffing for this? Because it's a very different approach to staffing when you move from a church that's based on people who are paid to run programs versus a church that's equipping people to be on mission in the everyday life. That's a pretty big shift you're going to make. And so you have to realize that's going to cost in ways that maybe you haven't thought through. So think through those costs carefully in terms of what it means for your present staff, your present programming, your present attenders that are part of the church that love everything that they're getting there, even the cost that it's going to take to meet with people, to explain it, to continually teach on it. It's years and years and years of incremental advances to get close to this kind of work. I'm not saying you shouldn't do it. I just think you should consider the cost. And I think it's why I would recommend that at first, if you're serious about this, ask yourself, could we at least start planting churches that will be able to start with that kind of zero-based budgeting from the very beginning?